Could one decision by a single leader alter the course of history? In the frozen fields of Eastern Europe, on the sun-scorched islands of the Pacific, and in the skies above Europe, ordinary people faced impossible choices. Secrets, codes, and daring strategies determined life and death. Join us as we reveal the hidden moments of World War II that no history book can fully capture. Part 1. The question that shook the world. What drives a world to destroy itself in flames? Less than 20 years after the armistice of World War I, the globe faced a new cataclysm. Tens of millions would die, cities would be reduced to rubble, and entire societies would be reshaped forever. Governments wavered, civilians feared for their lives, and the fragile post-war order crumbled beneath the weight of greed, ambition, and revenge. The Treaty of Versailles left Germany humiliated, burdened with crushing reparations, and politically unstable. Hyperinflation and mass unemployment created fertile ground for extremist ideologies. Adolf Hitler, a man with a vision of German supremacy, rose to power promising restoration and glory. Across Europe, Benito Mussolini stoked nationalism in Italy, while Japan's military leaders pursued imperial expansion in Asia. Despair and ambition collided, sowing the seeds for global war. Economic hardship was global. The Great Depression of the 1930s left millions unemployed and desperate. Banks collapsed, trade dwindled, and governments struggled to maintain social order. This chaos allowed authoritarian figures to present themselves as saviors, offering simple answers to complex problems. Ordinary people, hungry and fearful, were drawn to charismatic leaders who promised renewal and strength. Analysis. Historians such as Anthony Beevor emphasize that the convergence of political instability, economic collapse, and unresolved grievances from World War I created an environment where global conflict was almost inevitable. The League of Nations failed to act decisively against aggression, signaling that international oversight was insufficient. Citizens felt the tension. Families whispered in fear about rumors of new conflicts. Soldiers and reservists were mobilized, and governments prepared for the possibility of war. Yet, even with these warning signs, few could truly imagine the scale of destruction that lay ahead. Cities would burn, entire populations would be displaced, and the rules of warfare would change forever. Political alliances were forming in the shadows. Britain, France, and the United States watched as Germany and Italy expanded their influence unchecked. Japan advanced in Asia with brutal efficiency. Experts in geopolitics warned that appeasement might only delay the inevitable, yet most leaders hoped for peace. The world was at a tipping point, and the question remained, could humanity avert the storm, or was it doomed to repeat the horrors of the past? Cultural tension added another layer of complexity. Newspapers and radio broadcasts delivered mixed messages, some calling for vigilance, others for calm. Propaganda fueled fear and hatred, while ordinary citizens tried to maintain normal lives amid uncertainty. Social unrest grew as people struggled to understand the geopolitical forces shaping their destinies. Analysis. Margaret Macmillan and other historians argue that the failure to address grievances from World War I, coupled with the economic and political instability of the interwar years, made World War II almost inevitable. The lack of early, decisive action by international powers emboldened aggressor states, making the eruption of global war a matter of time rather than possibility. The human toll was already beginning. Refugees fled areas under threat, families were separated, and communities braced for conflict. Educational systems, economies, and cultural institutions were all affected, signaling that the coming war would impact every aspect of life. The storm was gathering momentum, and the world was about to witness events that would reshape history in ways previously unimaginable. Even in the arts and sciences, tension was palpable. Writers, filmmakers, and intellectuals sensed the approaching conflict and reflected it in their works. Scientific research increasingly focused on military applications, foreshadowing technological leaps that would emerge during wartime. The world was changing at an unprecedented pace, and the human capacity for both creation and destruction would soon be tested. As the globe edged closer to war, ordinary citizens could not escape the sense of looming catastrophe. The stage was set, the actors assembled, and the machinery of total war was beginning to turn. Humanity faced a defining question. Could lessons from the past prevent the horrors ahead, or were the forces of ambition and hatred too powerful to restrain? Part 2. The Shadow Rises. By the late 1930s, the Axis powers were aggressively pursuing territorial expansion across Europe and Asia. Germany's annexation of Austria in the 1938 Anschluss was executed with remarkable speed, consolidating Nazi power without military resistance. Shortly after, Hitler demanded the Sudetenland in Czechoslovakia under the pretense of protecting ethnic Germans. Britain and France, fearing another war, pursued a policy of appeasement, conceding territory in hopes of maintaining peace. Each concession, however, only emboldened Hitler, demonstrating that weakness in the face of aggression often invites further audacity. Italy under Mussolini sought to recreate the glory of a Roman Empire by invading Ethiopia in 1935 and extending influence across North Africa. The military campaigns were brutal, leaving civilians suffering from famine, disease, and mass executions. In the Far East, Japan expanded into Manchuria and later into China, with campaigns marked by unprecedented violence against both military and civilian populations. The global stage was shifting, and the specter of another world war loomed large. The economic context amplified tensions. The Great Depression had not yet fully abated, leaving European and Asian populations desperate. Unemployment, inflation, and social unrest created fertile ground for extremist ideologies to flourish. Leaders like Hitler and Mussolini capitalized on fear and nationalism, promising strength and security through conquest. Ordinary citizens, desperate for stability, were often complicit or powerless to resist. Analysis. Historian Max Hastings argues that the policy of appeasement emboldened Axis powers, showing that aggression could proceed unchecked. Democratic nations' hesitation to confront these regimes early allowed the Axis to consolidate power, increase military capabilities, and prepare for large-scale conflict. Early failures to act decisively demonstrated the dangers of political compromise in the face of growing tyranny. Diplomatic failures compounded the problem. Conferences and treaties were convened, yet lacked enforcement mechanisms. The League of Nations remained largely ineffective, its moral authority insufficient to restrain aggressor states. International observers warned that a global conflict was likely if stronger powers did not intervene promptly, but their warnings went largely unheeded. Propaganda intensified the social and political climate. Newspapers, radio, and public speeches across Europe portrayed Axis powers as defenders of national pride and strength. Meanwhile, Allied countries struggled to present coherent narratives, often focusing on appeasement rather than preparation. Citizens were caught in a web of misinformation, fear, and uncertainty, shaping public perception and complicating governmental responses. Military preparation advanced in parallel with political maneuvers. Germany rebuilt its army, air force, and navy, focusing on modern mechanized warfare. Italy and Japan similarly expanded their military capabilities. Civilians were mobilized for production and training, unknowingly preparing for a conflict of unprecedented scale. The world seemed on the verge of a catastrophe that would engulf every continent. Analysis. Scholars such as Margaret Macmillan emphasize that unresolved grievances from World War I, combined with economic depression and political instability, made the outbreak of global conflict almost inevitable. The failure to act decisively against early aggression created a sense of inevitability that emboldened Axis powers and demoralized potential opposition. As 1939 approached, the geopolitical map of Europe and Asia had shifted dramatically. Borders were redrawn, alliances formed, and populations were mobilized for war. Citizens and governments alike faced difficult choices, often balancing fear against duty. The stage was set, and the world braced for the conflict that would soon erupt with devastating consequences. Even cultural and intellectual spheres were affected. Artists, writers, and scientists observed the mounting tensions, often reflecting them in their works or research. Military technology advanced, including innovations in tanks, aircraft, and naval vessels, foreshadowing the scale of destruction that would soon unfold. Societies everywhere were preparing, knowingly or not, for a war that would redefine the 20th century. Families, communities, and entire nations felt the growing tension. Refugees fled areas under threat, political debates dominated public discourse, and citizens struggled with uncertainty about their futures. The combination of political, economic, and social pressures created an atmosphere of urgency, signaling that the shadow of war had fully risen and the world's path toward global conflict was nearly certain. Part 3. The Spark, Invasion of Poland. On September 1, 1939, the world witnessed the ignition of World War II with Germany's invasion of Poland. Utilizing the revolutionary Blitzkrieg tactic, German forces combined rapid mechanized infantry, armored divisions, and relentless aerial bombardment to overwhelm Polish defenses. Cities were targeted indiscriminately, and rail lines were destroyed, isolating both soldiers and civilians. Panic and confusion spread, with hundreds of thousands of refugees fleeing towns and villages in search of safety. The German army's precision and speed stunned military analysts worldwide. Within a week, key Polish cities such as Warsaw, Krakow, and Gdansk faced heavy bombardment and partial occupation. Civilians were caught in the crossfire, facing starvation, forced labor, and executions. The Polish military, despite valiant resistance, was unable to match the mechanized efficiency of the Wehrmacht. The Soviet Union, honoring its secret pact with Germany, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, invaded eastern Poland on September 17, 1939. Poland was effectively split between two aggressors, leaving its population in despair. Families were separated, villages destroyed, and cultural institutions looted or burned. The human toll was catastrophic, with countless civilians subjected to the horrors of occupation. Analysis. Military historian Richard Overy notes that the invasion of Poland demonstrated Germany's mastery of combined arms warfare and the devastating psychological effect of Blitzkrieg on both military and civilian populations. It also highlighted the consequences of political appeasement, as Britain and France, despite guarantees to Poland, were unprepared for immediate military intervention. Diplomatic channels failed completely. Britain and France declared war on Germany on September 3rd, but their support came too late to alter the course of Poland's swift defeat. The world realized that the era of European peace had ended, and global conflict was unavoidable. Polish resistance continued in various forms, including underground movements and partisan activity. These efforts, though unable to stop occupation, demonstrated the resilience and determination of a nation under siege. Civilian bravery in the face of overwhelming military power became a symbol of defiance and hope amid despair. Economic and social impacts were immediate. Farms and industries were commandeered by occupiers, leading to food shortages and labor exploitation. Schools and cultural centers were closed or repurposed for military use, disrupting the daily lives of millions. Refugees overwhelmed neighboring countries, straining resources and creating humanitarian crises that foreshadowed the broader suffering to come. Military logistics on both sides revealed critical lessons. Germany's effective coordination of tanks, infantry, and air support set a model for future campaigns, while the Polish reliance on outdated strategies underscored the importance of modernized defense. Strategists worldwide observed these developments, noting the implications for future conflicts. Analysis. The fall of Poland demonstrated how a nation could be quickly overwhelmed when unprepared for modern mechanized warfare. Experts argue that early intervention by Britain and France might have slowed Germany's momentum, but political indecision and misjudgment of German intentions allowed Blitzkrieg to succeed. The invasion had profound psychological effects. Entire populations lived in fear, morale collapsed, and communities faced the dual threat of two occupying armies. Poland's experience served as a grim warning to other European nations of the scale and speed of modern war. Even cultural life suffered dramatically. Libraries, museums, and educational institutions were targeted or destroyed, erasing centuries of heritage. Intellectuals and artists fled or were silenced, and propaganda flooded the media, shaping public perception and attempting to normalize occupation. The invasion of Poland marked not only the beginning of World War II, but also a shift in warfare itself. The speed, coordination, and scale of the operation illustrated the deadly effectiveness of mechanized and aerial combined operations. It forced nations to reconsider military strategies, alliances, and the importance of early mobilization. The global community was now fully alert. Refugees, diplomats, and military observers communicated the urgent need for preparedness. Governments accelerated armament production, restructured armed forces, and strengthened intelligence operations. The world stood at the precipice of a war that would engulf continents and reshape civilization. Analysis. Scholars emphasize that Poland's rapid defeat highlighted critical failures in collective security and early intervention. The lack of immediate, effective resistance allowed Germany to gain momentum, setting a precedent for future invasions and demonstrating that war, once started, could escalate beyond control. Amid the chaos, stories of human resilience emerged. Civilians risked lives to hide persecuted individuals, soldiers conducted daring counterattacks, and communities organized underground networks to maintain communication and resistance. These acts of courage foreshadowed the larger resistance movements that would become central to the Allied effort. Part 4. Blitzkrieg across Europe. Following the fall of Poland, Germany turned its attention to Western Europe, employing Blitzkrieg with terrifying efficiency. Denmark and Norway were invaded in April 1940, with coordinated air, sea, and land operations, overwhelming defenses within days. The speed and precision of German attacks stunned military observers, demonstrating a new era of mechanized warfare. By May 1940, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg faced swift invasions. German armored divisions bypassed fortifications, while air support suppressed enemy positions, creating chaos among defenders. Civilians were caught in the onslaught. Families fled cities, and refugee crises escalated. The German military displayed a terrifying combination of mobility, firepower, and coordination. France, once considered a formidable power, capitulated within 6 weeks. Paris fell under German control, and the French government was forced into exile in Vichy. British expeditionary forces executed a desperate retreat at Dunkirk, evacuating over 300,000 troops under heavy fire. The evacuation, though a logistical success, underscored the vulnerability of nations unprepared for modern mechanized conflict. Analysis. Blitzkrieg was not merely a tactic, it was psychological warfare. The speed and intensity demoralized enemy forces, while civilians witnessed unprecedented destruction. Military historians argue that this approach redefined 20th century warfare, emphasizing coordination, surprise, and mobility over static defense. The Battle of Britain followed, as Germany sought to neutralize the United Kingdom before launching an invasion. Luftwaffe raids targeted cities, airfields, and infrastructure, aiming to break British morale. However, the Royal Air Force, aided by radar technology and strategic planning, repelled the attacks. Britain's resilience became a symbol of hope, demonstrating that determination, technology, and intelligence could counter superior force. Italy, emboldened by early German successes, joined the war, opening fronts in North Africa. Battles in Libya and Egypt highlighted the global nature of the conflict and the strategic importance of colonial territories. Civilians in these regions endured occupation, disruption, and military campaigns, further demonstrating the war's far-reaching impact. Economic and social ramifications were immediate. Production shifted toward military needs, labor was mobilized, and civilians adapted to rationing and air raids. Refugees strained neighboring nations, while propaganda campaigns sought to maintain morale and encourage national unity. Every aspect of society felt the war's ripple effects. Analysis. Historians emphasize that Blitzkrieg's success was due to not only technology and tactics, but also careful planning and coordination. Civilian and military infrastructure was targeted strategically, demonstrating the integration of psychological and physical elements of warfare. As Germany prepared to invade the Soviet Union, Europe braced for the largest land conflict in history. The speed and ferocity of German attacks forced nations to re-evaluate defense strategies, alliances, and intelligence operations. The stage was set for a confrontation that would determine the fate of the continent. Cultural life also suffered. Museums, schools, and universities were closed or repurposed, intellectuals fled or were persecuted, and media became a tool for propaganda. Artists and writers documented the chaos, creating works that reflected both despair and resilience. The social fabric of Europe was being reshaped by war, with long-lasting consequences. Analysis. The early victories of Germany showed the limitations of static defenses and highlighted the importance of modernized, flexible military strategies. Experts note that the failure to anticipate mechanized warfare contributed significantly to the rapid fall of nations across Western Europe. Even as victories accumulated, tensions within the Axis alliance began to surface. Strategic disagreements, resource constraints, and diverging objectives hinted at future conflicts among allies. Meanwhile, occupied populations adapted to new regimes, often balancing survival with subtle forms of resistance, laying the groundwork for underground movements that would emerge later. The rapid succession of campaigns demonstrated that modern warfare was no longer confined to battlefields, but affected every aspect of society. Logistics, communication, and civilian cooperation became essential elements of military planning, signaling a transformation in how wars would be fought in the 20th century. The fall of France and the resilience of Britain established contrasting narratives, the devastation of Blitzkrieg versus the power of collective resolve. As Europe braced for the next phase, the world watched anxiously, aware that the conflict was escalating into a truly global war. Part 5. Operation Barbarossa. On June 22, 1941, Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest invasion in human history, targeting the Soviet Union. Over 3 million German troops, thousands of tanks and air squadrons, surged eastward in a meticulously planned offensive. Cities and towns were engulfed in flames as civilians suffered under relentless bombing. Supply lines stretched across vast territories, creating logistical nightmares, yet German forces pressed forward with overwhelming force. The initial phase was devastating. Leningrad, Minsk, and Smolensk faced intense bombardment, and Soviet defenses were quickly overrun in many areas. Millions of civilians were displaced, forced into labor, or executed. Resistance emerged in pockets, but the sheer speed and coordination of German mechanized divisions created chaos and panic. Hitler expected a swift victory, underestimating the Soviet Union's resilience and the harshness of the Russian winter. Soviet forces, although initially pushed back, adapted rapidly. Partisan movements, scorched earth tactics, and fortified positions slowed the German advance. Civilians and soldiers alike endured extreme hardship, with starvation and exposure taking heavy tolls. Stalingrad would later epitomize the brutality of this front, symbolizing the cost of urban warfare and the human spirit's endurance under unimaginable pressure. Analysis. Historian Anthony Beevor notes that Barbarossa marked a turning point in the war. Germany's initial successes were undermined by logistical overstretch, harsh weather, and tenacious Soviet resistance. Hitler's underestimation of the enemy ensured that the Eastern Front would consume the Wehrmacht's resources and manpower for years, ultimately contributing to the Axis downfall. Political implications were profound. Stalin's regime, though initially shocked, mobilized the entire nation for war. Factories were relocated eastward, and military production ramped up dramatically. Allied observers recognized that the Soviet Union, despite early losses, possessed the industrial capacity and human resources to endure a prolonged conflict. The human cost was staggering. Millions of soldiers on both sides perished, while civilians were subjected to massacres, deportations, and forced labor. The war's ideological dimension intensified, with Nazi policies aiming to destroy communism and enslave populations, creating a moral and humanitarian catastrophe of immense scale. Analysis. Military strategists highlight that Operation Barbarossa exposed the limits of Blitzkrieg when applied to vast territories with resilient populations. Supply chains, communication lines, and troop morale became decisive factors. Experts argue that the failure to achieve a rapid victory fundamentally altered the war's trajectory. Intelligence and reconnaissance played pivotal roles. The Germans relied on detailed maps, aerial surveillance, and signals intelligence, yet Soviet counterintelligence and code-breaking mitigated many advantages. Both sides adapted tactics continually, highlighting the dynamic and evolving nature of modern warfare. Economic and social consequences in occupied areas were severe. Agricultural lands were requisitioned, infrastructure destroyed, and populations subjected to strict control. Resistance networks formed despite the dangers, providing critical intelligence and sabotage operations that hindered the German war effort. Cultural impact was profound. Cities rich in history and heritage were damaged or destroyed, while intellectuals, educators, and artists faced persecution or exile. Propaganda emphasized ideological struggle, aiming to rally populations and maintain morale, reflecting the intersection of culture and conflict in total war. Analysis. Historians agree that the failure of Barbarossa demonstrates the perils of overambitious military planning and underestimation of opponents. Hitler's strategic miscalculations, coupled with logistical challenges, ensured that the Eastern Front would become the most brutal theater of World War II. Despite early German advances, Soviet counteroffensives gradually stabilized the front. The resilience of civilians and military personnel alike foreshadowed the eventual turning of the tide. Operation Barbarossa revealed that industrial capacity, morale, and adaptability were as crucial as tactical superiority. The operation also had global implications. The prolonged conflict in the East diverted German attention and resources from other theaters, creating opportunities for the Allies elsewhere. It emphasized that World War II was no longer confined to Europe's Western Front, but had become a truly multi-front global conflict. Part 6. Pearl Harbor, America enters the war. December 7, 1941, dawned as a day that would forever alter history. The Japanese surprise attack on Pearl Harbor devastated the U.S. Pacific Fleet, sinking or damaging multiple battleships, destroying aircraft, and killing over 2,400 Americans. The audacity of the strike shocked the nation, and public outrage swiftly galvanized American support for war. Within 24 hours, the United States declared war on Japan, marking its full-scale entry into World War II. Japan's operational strategy demonstrated remarkable coordination. Fleets moved undetected across vast distances, striking targets simultaneously to maximize destruction. This rapid expansion was mirrored throughout Southeast Asia, with Japanese forces capturing the Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, and Burma. Their swift victories showcased tactical brilliance, but came at a heavy cost for local populations, who suffered massacres, forced labor, and the disruption of traditional communities. American mobilization was immediate. Factories shifted to wartime production, training programs accelerated, and propaganda campaigns encouraged enlistment and civilian support. Economic resources were harnessed at an unprecedented scale, demonstrating the industrial and organizational capacity of the United States to sustain a multi-theater war. The nation transformed almost overnight from a peacetime economy to a global war machine. Analysis. Military strategist Victor Davis Hanson highlights that Japan miscalculated the American response. Instead of demoralizing the United States, Pearl Harbor united the population and unleashed a mobilization that would ultimately overwhelm Japanese forces. The attack also emphasized the role of intelligence, planning, and risk in determining the outcomes of early war operations. The U.S. entry into the war shifted the global balance of power. Allied nations now had access to vast industrial, technological, and human resources, significantly enhancing their operational capabilities. Coordination between Europe and the Pacific became a central strategic priority, requiring complex logistics and diplomacy. The human toll was immediate. Sailors, soldiers, and civilians perished in harbors and airfields, while Japanese military advances displaced millions. Refugees from occupied territories fled towards safer regions, creating humanitarian crises that would continue throughout the Pacific theater. Analysis. Scholars note that Pearl Harbor exemplified the dangers of underestimating industrial capacity, national resolve, and intelligence potential. While tactically brilliant, the strategic outcome favored the Allies in the long term, as it provoked the full might of the United States into global conflict. Military technology played a pivotal role. Aircraft carriers, radar, and naval coordination became central to Pacific operations. The battle foreshadowed a shift in naval warfare, where air power would surpass traditional battleships as the decisive factor in controlling oceans. Cultural and societal changes followed. Women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers, contributing to industrial output and shaping post-war social dynamics. Media coverage documented heroism, tragedy, and strategic developments, influencing public perception and morale. Analysis. Pearl Harbor underscores the interconnectedness of strategy, technology, and morale. The event demonstrated that even well-executed surprise attacks could have unintended consequences, particularly when they mobilize a previously neutral power into full engagement. Japanese expansion across Asia continued rapidly after the attack, but logistical challenges, extended supply lines, and the resilience of local populations eventually slowed their advance. Resistance movements, intelligence efforts, and strategic miscalculations gradually eroded their initial momentum. Economic and diplomatic consequences were profound. The United States established Lend-Lease support for allies, coordinated joint military planning, and leveraged global economic power to sustain a multi-front war. The Pearl Harbor attack thus catalyzed not only military, but also political and economic transformations that would shape the rest of the conflict. Civilian populations endured significant hardship, from occupation to forced labor and resource shortages. The war impacted education, infrastructure, and daily life, demonstrating that total war extends beyond soldiers and battlefields into every aspect of society. Analysis. The attack on Pearl Harbor marked a turning point in World War II. It demonstrated the interplay of strategy, human resilience, and industrial might. Experts emphasized that the event's long-term consequences far outweighed its immediate tactical success for Japan, reshaping the trajectory of global conflict. As the United States entered the war, the stage was set for a truly global confrontation, stretching from the Atlantic to the Pacific. Coordinated Allied efforts would now challenge Axis dominance on multiple fronts, heralding a new phase of total war that demanded innovation, sacrifice, and resilience from nations and individuals alike. Part 7. Turning Points of 1942-1943. The years 1942 and 1943 marked decisive turning points in World War II, signaling the beginning of the Axis powers' gradual decline. In the Pacific, the Battle of Midway in June 1942 showcased the importance of intelligence and strategy. American forces, having intercepted Japanese codes, anticipated the attack and set a trap. 4 Japanese carriers were destroyed, reversing Japan's expansion and marking the first major defeat in the Pacific. In Europe, the Battle of Stalingrad became the epitome of brutal urban warfare. From August 1942 to February 1943, German and Soviet forces clashed in a city reduced to rubble. Civilians faced starvation, bombings, and forced labor, while soldiers endured freezing temperatures and relentless combat. The surrender of the German Sixth Army marked a psychological and strategic blow, demonstrating that Nazi forces were not invincible. In North Africa, the Allies faced Rommel's Afrika Korps in a struggle over the Suez Canal and Middle Eastern oil. The Second Battle of El Alamein, fought between October and November 1942, resulted in a decisive Allied victory under General Bernard Montgomery. This success secured supply lines, bolstered morale, and ensured continued pressure on Axis forces from the south. Analysis. Military historian John Keegan emphasizes that these battles highlighted the critical role of intelligence, logistics, and industrial capacity. Axis forces, once thought unstoppable, now faced multi-front setbacks and stretched resources, illustrating the limits of expansion without sustainable supply and strategic depth. The human toll of these turning points was staggering. Millions of soldiers died, while civilians were displaced or killed. Refugee flows increased, overwhelming local resources and creating humanitarian crises across continents. The urban devastation of Stalingrad symbolized the immense sacrifices required to halt Axis advances. Analysis. Experts note that these battles shifted momentum, forcing Axis powers into defensive positions. They demonstrated that technological superiority and tactical skill alone were insufficient without sustainable supply lines, strategic planning, and resilient morale among both military and civilian populations. The political impact was equally significant. Allied victories boosted public morale, strengthened international coalitions, and facilitated increased military aid and coordination. The United States and Soviet Union began to coordinate efforts more closely, while Britain solidified its role as a central Allied power, ensuring a united front against Axis aggression. Economic consequences were profound. The industrial might of the United States and Soviet Union enabled sustained offensives, while Axis economies struggled under the weight of prolonged conflict. Resource shortages, transportation bottlenecks, and labor strain undermined military campaigns and domestic stability, contributing to the eventual decline of Axis capabilities. Cultural and psychological effects resonated across the globe. Media and propaganda emphasized heroism and resilience, inspiring resistance movements and civilian support for military efforts. Stories of individual courage in Stalingrad, Midway, and El Alamein highlighted human endurance and the moral stakes of the war. Analysis. These turning points revealed the interplay between strategy, logistics, intelligence, and morale. They underscored the importance of sustained industrial output, coordinated alliances, and adaptive leadership in determining the trajectory of global conflict. Resistance movements gained momentum. In occupied Europe, underground networks provided intelligence, conducted sabotage, and supported Allied operations. These efforts, though often small in scale, had significant strategic impact, slowing Axis operations and contributing to the larger Allied war effort. Simultaneously, the Pacific theater continued to evolve. The United States implemented island-hopping campaigns, gradually reclaiming territory and isolating Japanese strongholds. These operations demonstrated the importance of air power, naval dominance, and strategic foresight in achieving long-term objectives. Analysis. Historians emphasize that the period of 1942–1943 demonstrated a critical shift from Axis expansion to strategic defense. The combination of military victories, intelligence successes, and industrial superiority allowed the Allies to gain momentum, ultimately shaping the course of World War II. The human cost remained immense, with civilians suffering through occupation, forced labor, and resource shortages. Yet these turning points offered hope and demonstrated that coordinated strategic efforts could alter the trajectory of a global conflict, even against formidable adversaries. Part 8. Allied counteroffensives and collapse of the Axis. D-Day, June 6, 1944, marked a pivotal moment in the European theater. Allied forces launched a massive amphibious invasion of Normandy, combining land, air, and naval operations with meticulous coordination. Over 156,000 troops crossed the English Channel, facing fortified German defenses and relentless gunfire. The invasion established a crucial foothold, allowing the Allies to push inland and liberate occupied territories. The liberation of France unfolded over months of intense combat. Cities were retaken one by one, while German forces were forced into a gradual retreat. Civilians suffered during battles and occupations, enduring bombings, forced labor, and food shortages. Despite these hardships, the momentum of Allied advances bolstered morale and demonstrated the effectiveness of coordinated multinational military efforts. Simultaneously, the Soviet Union advanced from the east, liberating territories and inflicting severe losses on German forces. Urban warfare in cities such as Warsaw and Budapest highlighted the ferocity of combat and the resilience of both military personnel and civilians. Coordination between Western and Eastern allies was vital in applying consistent pressure on the Axis. Analysis. Military historians emphasize that the success of Allied counteroffensives relied on logistics, planning, and coordination across multiple fronts. The combination of air superiority, naval dominance, and ground tactics was instrumental in overwhelming German defenses and reversing years of Axis expansion. In the Pacific, island-hopping campaigns brought U.S. forces closer to Japan. Battles in the Solomon Islands, New Guinea, and the Philippines showcased the importance of naval power, air support, and amphibious operations. Civilians in these regions endured occupation, bombardment, and disruption of daily life, illustrating the global human cost of war. Analysis. Experts highlight that multi-front coordination forced Axis powers to spread resources thin, undermining their ability to resist effectively. Superior logistics, industrial output, and tactical planning enabled the Allies to maintain momentum and exploit weaknesses. The fall of Berlin in May 1945 marked the definitive collapse of Nazi Germany. Hitler's regime disintegrated, and the war in Europe officially ended. Cities were in ruins, populations displaced, and the moral consequences of atrocities, including the Holocaust, were fully revealed. Allied forces faced the daunting task of reconstruction, dealing with both physical destruction and psychological trauma. Economic consequences were profound. Europe's infrastructure was devastated, agriculture disrupted, and industrial output destroyed. Recovery required international aid, coordination, and long-term planning, including initiatives like the Marshall Plan to rebuild economies and prevent political instability. Cultural impact was immense. Educational institutions, museums, and historic sites were damaged or destroyed. Survivors documented their experiences, creating historical records and narratives that informed future generations about the cost of totalitarianism and total war. Resistance movements across Europe had played pivotal roles. Underground networks, sabotage operations, and intelligence gathering contributed significantly to the Allied efforts. These grassroots actions demonstrated the power of civilian participation in shaping military outcomes. Analysis. The collapse of the Axis demonstrates that strategic overextension, resource limitations, and failure to adapt can undermine even initially dominant powers. The Allied success was a combination of planning, industrial strength, intelligence, and human resilience. Simultaneously, in the Pacific, Japan continued to resist, leading to fierce battles such as Iwo Jima and Okinawa. High casualties among soldiers and civilians underscored the intensity and desperation of the final stages of conflict. The strategic decision to deploy atomic weapons ultimately forced Japan's surrender in August 1945, ending the war globally. The social consequences were lasting. Millions were displaced, economies required reconstruction, and societies grappled with trauma and moral reckoning. Lessons learned emphasized the importance of international cooperation, post-war planning, and human rights initiatives to prevent future global conflicts. Analysis. Historians agree that the collapse of the Axis illustrates the interplay of strategy, industrial capacity, alliance coordination, and civilian resilience. It underscores the necessity of comprehensive planning and sustained effort to achieve victory in total war. The Allied counteroffensives, culminating in the fall of Berlin and Japan's surrender, reshaped global geopolitics. New international institutions, such as the United Nations, emerged to foster diplomacy and prevent future large-scale conflicts, reflecting the lessons learned from unprecedented devastation. Part 9. The human cost and moral reckoning. World War II was not only a clash of armies, but a catastrophe of human suffering. Millions of civilians perished due to bombings, occupation policies, forced labor, starvation, and massacres. The Holocaust alone claimed the lives of 6 million Jews, alongside millions of Romani people, disabled individuals, political dissidents, and others. Entire communities were erased, leaving lasting scars on global consciousness. The civilian experience was marked by fear, displacement, and deprivation. Refugees fled advancing armies, often without food, shelter, or medical care. Cities such as Warsaw, Dresden, Hiroshima, and Nagasaki bore the brunt of aerial bombardments, leaving survivors to cope with destruction, trauma, and loss of family. Psychological impacts persisted long after the war ended, influencing post-war culture and society. Soldiers, too, endured unimaginable hardships. On all fronts, men faced extreme conditions, from frozen trenches in Russia to tropical diseases in the Pacific. Combat fatigue, injuries, and constant threat of death defined daily life for millions, yet camaraderie, resilience, and determination often sustained them. Personal narratives reveal acts of heroism, sacrifice, and moral choice amid chaos. Analysis. Historians like Richard Overy emphasize that the human cost of WWII far exceeded previous conflicts. Total war blurred lines between combatants and civilians, with strategic bombing and occupation policies intentionally targeting societal infrastructure to weaken enemy morale. The ethical dilemmas raised by such tactics remain subjects of study and debate. The moral reckoning extended beyond immediate casualties. Decisions such as the deployment of atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, while hastening the end of the war, sparked profound ethical debates about civilian targeting, proportionality, and long-term consequences. Governments and societies grappled with questions of justice, retribution, and reconciliation in the post-war era. Resistance movements highlighted the human capacity for courage and moral action. Civilians engaged in underground operations, smuggling, and espionage at great personal risk. These acts not only aided military campaigns, but preserved cultural heritage and human dignity under oppressive regimes. Economic devastation compounded human suffering. Industrial centers were destroyed, agricultural production collapsed, and infrastructure was in ruins. Populations faced famine, disease, and social instability. Recovery required years of international aid, planning, and coordination, exemplified by initiatives like the Marshall Plan in Europe and post-war reconstruction in Asia. Analysis. Scholars argue that understanding WWII requires integrating both military and human perspectives. While strategies, battles, and politics shape historical narratives, the experiences of civilians and soldiers reveal the profound consequences of total war on human life, culture, and morality. The cultural and intellectual aftermath was significant. Artists, writers, and filmmakers documented atrocities and survival stories, shaping collective memory and global awareness. Educational and memorial initiatives ensured that lessons from the war would inform future generations and reinforce the importance of human rights and international law. Psychological studies reveal lasting effects on survivors, including PTSD, loss of identity, and generational trauma. Communities had to rebuild not only physical infrastructure, but social cohesion and trust. Reconciliation efforts and war crimes trials, such as Nuremberg, addressed moral and legal responsibility, setting precedents for international justice. Analysis. The human cost and moral reckoning of WWII underscore that the consequences of global conflict extend beyond territory and politics. They shape societies, influence law, and leave enduring legacies in collective memory, emphasizing the responsibility of nations and individuals to prevent recurrence. The final reckoning included documenting atrocities, prosecuting war criminals, and rebuilding societal institutions. Memorials, museums, and education initiatives preserved history while honoring victims. Lessons learned about genocide, occupation policies, and civilian protection informed international law and diplomatic practices. Global awareness of civilian suffering led to post-war initiatives aimed at human rights, humanitarian law, and the prevention of future conflicts. Organizations like the United Nations and the Geneva Conventions were designed to protect individuals from the horrors witnessed during WWII. The human cost also influenced post-war geopolitics. Societies reshaped their governments, economies, and international relations in response to trauma and lessons learned. Collective memory influenced culture, policy, and diplomacy for decades, demonstrating the enduring legacy of the war on global civilization. Part 10. The End and the Lessons Learned. The conclusion of World War II in 1945 marked the end of the most devastating conflict in human history. In Europe, Germany surrendered in May following the fall of Berlin after Hitler's suicide and the disintegration of the Nazi command. In the Pacific, Japan capitulated in August following the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the Soviet invasion of Manchuria. The war left nations in ruins, economies devastated, and millions of lives lost. The geopolitical landscape was irrevocably altered. Europe faced reconstruction under Allied occupation, while the United States and the Soviet Union emerged as superpowers, setting the stage for the Cold War. Borders were redrawn, new nations emerged, and international institutions were formed to promote peace and prevent future global conflicts. The United Nations, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank exemplified attempts to create structures for diplomacy, economic stability, and conflict resolution. Analysis. Historians such as Anthony Beaver and Margaret Macmillan emphasize that the lessons of WWII extend beyond military strategy. They underscore the importance of international cooperation, early intervention against aggressors, protection of human rights, and the dangers of unchecked totalitarian regimes. The war demonstrated that political, economic, and moral factors are intertwined in shaping history. The human and cultural cost remained profound. Millions were displaced, orphaned, or permanently scarred by physical and psychological trauma. Cities required rebuilding, infrastructure reconstruction, and social reintegration. Education, healthcare, and cultural institutions became focal points for recovery, aiming to restore societal cohesion and rebuild trust among communities torn apart by conflict. Economically, nations faced the monumental task of reconstruction. Europe's industries and agriculture had to be revived, requiring foreign aid, investment, and coordinated planning. Japan rebuilt its economy under Allied guidance, becoming a model for rapid post-war industrial recovery. Global trade networks were reconstructed, and innovations from wartime technology found peacetime applications, influencing transportation, medicine, and communications. Analysis. Economists and historians argue that post-war reconstruction efforts, such as the Marshall Plan, highlight the critical role of coordinated international aid, investment, and governance in preventing renewed instability and promoting long-term peace. Politically, WWII has prompted the establishment of new norms and institutions aimed at ensuring justice and stability. The Nuremberg trials and subsequent war crimes tribunals set legal precedents for prosecuting crimes against humanity. International law was codified and reinforced, emphasizing accountability and the protection of civilians during conflict. Culturally, societies grappled with remembrance, memorialization, and education. Museums, memorials, literature, and films chronicled personal and collective experiences, ensuring that the lessons of WWII remained present in global consciousness. Survivor testimonies shaped public awareness of genocide, occupation, and resistance, reinforcing the imperative to uphold human dignity. Analysis. Scholars emphasize that the legacy of WWII illustrates the interconnectedness of human experience, ethics, politics, and strategy. The conflict serves as a perpetual reminder of the consequences of totalitarian ambition, aggressive expansion, and moral indifference, while also celebrating resilience, courage, and international solidarity. Technological advancements from WWII continued to shape global society. Innovations in aviation, computing, nuclear energy, and medicine transformed civilian and military life, reflecting how conflict can accelerate progress while exacting a heavy human toll. The war's conclusion also emphasized reconciliation and diplomacy. Nations forged alliances, treaties, and cooperative frameworks aimed at preventing future conflicts. The Cold War era would follow, but the foundation for modern international relations was established in the lessons learned from global catastrophe. The enduring legacy of WWII is multifaceted: strategic, political, economic, cultural, and moral. Understanding the events, decisions, and human experiences allows contemporary society to navigate challenges with awareness of past mistakes and achievements. The war serves as both a warning and a guide for future generations. Analysis. The end of WWII demonstrates that victory is not merely military, but encompasses moral clarity, reconstruction, and the restoration of human dignity. The lessons learned emphasize vigilance against aggression, the value of cooperation, and the importance of remembering the human cost of conflict. Finally, the world emerged with a renewed commitment to peace, human rights, and international law. Memorials, education, and global cooperation continue to honor the sacrifices made and to prevent repetition of such devastation. WWII's history serves as a narrative of tragedy, heroism, and the enduring strength of humanity in the face of unimaginable adversity. World War II reshaped the world through battles, betrayals, and the unimaginable courage of millions. From the icy plains of Russia to the islands of the Pacific, history was written with fire, sacrifice, and determination. If you want to understand not just the events but the human stories behind them, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe. Share this video with anyone who loves history. And leave a comment below telling us which battle or story impacted you the most. And don't miss our next video, where we dive into critical intelligence. How secrets and spies turned the tide of WWII. You'll see how codebreakers, espionage, and secret operations shaped the outcome of the war in ways few people realize.